But Bryan Counter points out the fullness of these days of reading depends, paradoxically, on our reading being interrupted. Hey everybody, thank you for watching Leaf by Leaf, and welcome to the third episode of the Why Do We Read Fiction series. I hope you're enjoying it so far. Today I've got sort of a hodgepodge of different sources that I'm pulling together, but I have to thank, first and foremost, Bryan Counter. I've talked about him before on this channel. I think when I did my Maurice Blanchot video last year. I can't even remember how Bryan and I came into contact. I think he saw one of my Proust videos. He happens to be working on a dissertation up in Buffalo that has to do with the phenomenology of aesthetic experience, focusing on Proust's work as well as other writers. And over the Christmas break, he just simply sent me the 4-page transcript of a talk that he gave, I think in Boston, at a library in Boston, about why we read. And it just so happens that I was planning on starting the series, and so I was eager to get my hands on his talk, which then led me to one of his many sources, which is Peter Schwenger, an essay called Reading's Residue. And so I'm greatly indebted to Bryan Counter for this episode. Both Bryan and Peter Schwenger point to major points that Proust gave in his preface to John Ruskin and the translations he did, and also his On Reading essay. A good collection of the different pieces Proust did that have to do with reading are found in this Days of Reading slim little paperback from Penguin that I've had for a long time, and also On Reading Ruskin in this nice little hardback from Yale. In short, Bryan Counter presents this talk that, in my summation, the best point or the major point is that there is a quiet dimension of our lives that the act of reading can illuminate and enlarge, whether we're aware of it or not. There's what he calls an aesthetic dimension of our lives that is touched and activated when we read great literature. But we should note that when he uses the term aesthetic, he's not talking about the way that we think of it today, which means the particular style, what something looks or sounds like. He's going back to the ancient Greek term aesthesis, which refers more specifically to a sensation or perception. What is literary or art-like about our daily lives is aesthetic in what I would call a quiet way. I love that. What I mean by this is that the aesthetic dimension of our lives, as something that we can learn from literature, is not necessarily connected to a larger plot. And that's the very reason we reread a book or rewatch a film or repeatedly listen to an album. It is a feeling that cannot be named or anticipated. And so there's this big gulf or chasm or rupture that's presented there. Because the very thing that I think I'm getting at in this investigatory series of Why We Read is something that many people, including Bryan Counter, including Calinescu, as we will see soon, including Peter Schwenger, who cites Mate Calinescu, Gerald Murnane, who comes up here in a moment, tried to put our finger on it, but it's something that is a sensation, a feeling that almost can't be articulated. Yet I think it is the very fount or locus of what drives us to fiction over and over again. Let's see if we can probe at its attributes a little more, as Schwenger says. Both Bryan Counter and Peter Schwenger point to the same source, which is Proust in response to Ruskin. And I'll quote this at length the same way that Bryan did in his talk. There are perhaps no days of our childhood we live so fully as those we believe we left without having lived them, those we spent with a favorite book. Everything that filled them for others, so it seemed, and that we dismissed as a vulgar obstacle to a divine pleasure. the game for which a friend would come to fetch us at the most interesting passage, the troublesome bee or sun ray that forced us to lift our eyes from the page or to change position, the provisions for the afternoon snack that we had been made to take along and that we left beside us on the bench without touching, while above our head the sun was diminishing in force in the blue sky. The dinner we had to return home for, and during which we thought only of going up immediately afterward to finish the interrupted chapter. All those things which reading should have kept us from feeling anything but annoyance at. It has, on the contrary, engraved in us so sweet a memory, so much more precious to our present judgment than what we had read then with such love, that if we still happen today to leaf through those books of another time, it is for no other reason than that they are the only calendars we have kept of the days that have vanished, and we hope to see reflected on their pages the dwellings and the ponds which no longer exist. This is both a beautiful and very involved passage. But Bryan Counter points out the fullness of these days of reading depends, paradoxically, on our reading being interrupted. And I didn't catch this the first few times I read this same essay on reading by Proust over the years. It just seemed to me to be rolled up in, using reading as a sort of Madeline in a lime blossom tea to recapture, regain the times that we have lost. And I sort of tossed aside the fact that Proust is incorporating the fact that we're being interrupted as something that is intrinsic to that aesthetic response and the beauty of memory that's wrapped up in the books we have read. Counter says that reading, or for that matter, engaging with any kind of art, can teach us how to recognize something already at work within our everyday lives, something already literary or art-like, which he calls something aesthetic. He sums up his talk by saying literature, art, teaches us to recognize, to pay more attention, to become attuned to these moments, not only in a formal way when dealing with works of art, but also in our daily lives. Moving over to Reading's Residue by Peter Schwenger. And this is my little summary after reading it. The experience of reading something that brings intense pleasure is something I wish I could tap into in such a way to articulate the raw, original experience for others, for you. As it is, though, when I talk about books I have read, I'm talking about not the experience of reading them, but I'm talking about the memory of having read them. And this is something that is virtually inescapable. And it separates out, strikingly, the reader from the critic, the reader in real time experiencing and activating that quiet aesthetic dimension of our lives while reading, but then the critic who is sort of recreating for others an artificial experience of having read the book. At the very start of this essay, Schwenger brings in Gerald Murnane, who he says is a writer who is fascinated by what happens when we have read once the book has been returned to the shelf. And this essay alone has made me so excited to read the work, finally get around to reading Murnane's work. But let's continue on. This essay then will address itself to the nature of what remains in memory after we have closed a work of fiction and allowed it to recede in time. And so this is getting at the same thing that Proust says is tantamount to these books all around me being the only calendars I have, the only time portals I have to days I have lost. And indeed, often when I peruse the spines, I will usually immediately think of the sensations, the aesthetic dimension of where I was at times when I read such and such a book, usually even ahead of what the book was about or things in it that stood out. Schwenger calls on Mate Calinescu, who says, when I write about what the first reading of a literary piece is like, I cannot but place myself in the perspective of rereading. So this is the critic trying to write, or me trying to tell you these things. He then quotes Peter Mendelssohn, who says that when we discuss the feeling of reading, we are really talking about the memory of having read. So how do we get beyond this? We are bounded by a nutshell. And though we count ourselves king of infinite space, we're still bounded. We can't transcend the nutshell and inspect that. Because we have been so absorbed in the experience, the aesthetic experience of reading the book, we cannot fully then describe it. We can't be superimposed to where we can be both reading and experiencing the reading and assessing the experience all at the same time. Now, maybe the discoveries in quantum entanglement will eventually lead us down a path where we humans can be in two places at the same time and connected. Murnane is suggesting that the most important aspect of reading fiction emerges after the book is closed, even long after. It is a matter of becoming aware of new images arising in the mind, the results of a kind of alchemy involving both the author and the reader. This is an essence of the book that does not consist of summing up in a few words, but is, rather, an awareness of all the multiple connections that have been put into motion by this fictional experience, an awareness that almost immediately diffuses into emotion. That's exactly how I feel about this. The more I've read these remarks and thought about this and prepared for this little episode, the more placing my finger on this thing that diffuses into emotion, as Schwenger just said, I feel like I'm nailing or trying to nail Jello to a tree. Now we have the concept, though, of this quiet aesthetic dimension within us that depends not only on the reading of fiction to activate and operate, but the interruptions of reality around us. This all works as a binding, as it were. And furthermore, the more we read and the more we reread, the more these total moments of phenomenological aesthetic experience start to inform one another. Or putting it as Schwenger does, the components of the book, a given book that I'm reading at a time, join with the components of one's personal memory, or rather that which we do not remember, a network stretching out of sight. Shadowy recollections of one book may then become part of the penumbra that we provide for another book. So now we've got this never-ending branching of this tree of our lives reading fiction that is not only branching out, but overlapping. Reading, asserts Proust in the preface to his translation of Ruskin, is the threshold of spiritual life. This is not because of what the words say or the wisdom they impart. That is Ruskin's contention, one that Proust explicitly resists. What happens to books in one's memory is subtler than that. So once again, we're pushing up against this subtle, quiet, elusive, exceedingly complex something in us that causes us to not only continue to read fiction, but to reread the same fiction. And so for the next episode, I want to focus on rereading, why we do it, what it is, and why it's such a pleasure for some people.